On the morning of the 24th of June, 1833, a wooden warship floated quietly into a chamber of cut granite at the edge of Boston Harbor. And then the strangest thing happened to her. The water around her began to disappear. Commodore Jesse Duncan Elliott, the commandant of the Charlestown Navy Yard, stood on the stone coping above and watched as steam pumps pulled the harbor out from under the most famous ship in the United States Navy, the frigate Constitution, the ship people already called Old Ironsides. Inch by inch, she settled, until her keel came to rest on a row of wooden blocks on a floor of dry granite, with the sea held out on every side by a wall of stone that men had carved and set entirely by hand. The man who had designed that wall was an engineer named Lomi Baldwin, born in Woburn in 1780, a man some call a father of American civil engineering. He had spent 6 years building a hole in the ground that could hold the ocean out. I went looking for the full story of how a young country with almost no machines decided to carve a granite room in the harbor strong enough to cradle a warship in open air. What I found is one of the most quietly astonishing things Americans ever built. And it is still working today, almost 200 years later, holding the same ship. So let me show you what it actually took, and why the Navy had no choice but to try. To understand why anyone would carve a granite chamber to hold a ship out of the water, you first have to understand what it meant to own a wooden navy with nowhere to dock it. In the early 1800s, the United States Navy was small, proud, and almost entirely made of wood. Ships like the Constitution were built of live oak and white oak and southern pine, held together with copper bolts and tree nails, and they were marvels on the water. But wood in saltwater is wood under attack from the first day it floats. Marine worms bore into the planking below the waterline. The copper sheathing that protected the hull wears and tears. Seams open, the caulking works loose, and rot creeps into the great timbers where no one can see it. A wooden warship is always quietly dying from the bottom up, and the only way to save her is to get her completely out of the water so men can reach every plank of her hull. And there was the problem. In all of the United States, there was no good way to do that. To clean or repair a ship's bottom, navies used a brutal old method called careening. They would haul the ship close to a wharf, run heavy tackle from her mast to the shore, and drag her over until she lay on her side, half out of the water, masts leaning at a frightening angle. Men would then scramble over the exposed hull to scrape and patch it before tipping her the other way to do the rest. Careening strained the hull, sprung the masts, and put real stress on a ship that was supposed to last for decades. It was dangerous, it was slow, and it could never expose the whole bottom at once. Some yards had marine railways, a kind of inclined track that could drag a smaller vessel partway out of the water on a cradle, but a railway strong enough to haul a heavy frigate fully clear of the sea simply did not exist on American soil. It helps to understand just how relentless the enemy below the waterline really was. The warm coastal waters were full of a creature sailors feared more than almost any storm: the shipworm, a long, pale mollusk that bores into submerged wood and hollows out a great timber from the inside until it crumbles. To fight it, the Navy sheathed the bottoms of its ships in thin sheets of copper, nailed plate by plate over the planking, because the worm will not eat through copper. But copper sheathing tears and corrodes and works loose in service, and the moment a gap opens, the worm and the rot find the wood beneath. A copper-bottomed frigate had to be checked, patched, and recoppered again and again across her life, and not 1 inch of that work can be done while the ship floats. The copper, the caulking, the worm-eaten planks, all of it lives below the waterline in the one part of the ship that careening could never fully expose, and a man could never properly reach with the sea still in the way. A wooden navy without a dry dock was a navy fighting the shipworm with one hand tied behind its back. So the great warships of the early republic aged faster than they had to. The Constitution herself, the hero of the War of 1812, the ship that had beaten the British frigate Guerriere off the coast and earned her iron nickname when cannonballs seemed to bounce off her oak sides, was rotting where no one could properly reach her. By the 1820s, her timbers were soft in places, her hull was tired, and there were officials in Washington who quietly wondered whether the famous ship was even worth saving. A nation that had built her could not properly repair her because it had nowhere to lay her bare. That is the wound at the center of this whole story. The young United States could win battles at sea, but it could not yet take care of the ships that won them. The answer was an idea as old as the Romans and as new, in America, as anything anyone had tried. A dry dock. The principle is simple to say and very hard to build. You dig a great basin at the edge of deep water, line it with stone so it will not collapse or leak, and fit a watertight gate across its mouth. You open the gate, flood the basin, and float the ship inside. Then you close the gate against the sea and you pump every drop of water out of the basin until the ship comes gently to rest on blocks at the bottom, sitting upright on dry land with her whole hull exposed from keel to waterline. Men can then walk completely around her and under her on dry stone in the open air and rebuild her at their ease. The sea is locked out by the gate and the stone, held back by nothing but the strength of the masonry and the will of the men who cut it. The United States Congress finally committed to that idea in the spring of 1827. It passed an act ordering the construction of 2 stone dry docks for the Navy, identical twins, one at the Charlestown Navy Yard just across the river from Boston, and one at the Gosport Yard near Norfolk in Virginia. The Navy needed a man who could turn that order into stone, and it chose Loammi Baldwin to design and build both. I want to stay with Baldwin for a moment, because the man is the reason the thing stands. He was the son of a Revolutionary War officer, and he came to engineering the way the best men of that age did, not through a classroom, but through the work itself. As a boy of 14, he was already laboring alongside his father and his brothers on the Middlesex Canal, the 27-mile waterway that linked the Merrimack River to the port of Boston. He learned how water behaves, how earth and stone hold or fail, how you move heavy things with rope and timber and patience. He went on to Harvard and graduated in 1800, tried the law, found it dull, and gave it up to open an engineering office in Charlestown in 1807. By the time the Navy came to him, he was one of the most respected engineers in the country, and the dry dock would become the work he is best remembered for. His chief assistant on the job was Alexander Paris, a gifted Boston architect and engineer born in 1789, the man who would oversee much of the actual construction. Between Baldwin's design and Paris's hand on the site, the two of them set out to carve a room for the ocean. The cornerstone went down on the 10th of July, 1827. John Quincy Adams was president that summer, and because the work began under his administration, the project was first known as the Adams Dry Dock. From that first stone, it would take 6 long years to finish. If the idea of moving water and stone by hand on this scale is the kind of history you came here for, I want to point you to the project that opened the whole age of American hand-built engineering, the Erie Canal, dug clear across the state of New York with shovels and wheelbarrows and animal muscle. I have put the full illustrated story of it into a book, and you can scan the code on your screen and start reading it tonight. Now think about what those 6 years actually asked of the men who worked them. The dock had to be carved out of the ground at the edge of a tidal harbor, which means the first enemy was the sea itself, trying to fill the hole as fast as they could dig it. The crews built a cofferdam, a temporary barrier of timber, and packed earth thrown up around the worksite to hold the harbor back, and behind that barrier they dug down through mud and gravel and clay until they reached solid ground that could bear the weight of stone. Every day the tide pressed against that cofferdam, and every day the men kept the water out by main force, pumping and bailing and shoring, just to keep the floor of their future dock dry enough to work. And then came the granite. This is the heart of the by-hand story, because the chamber that holds the ocean is built of stone that men cut from a hillside 1 block at a time. The granite came from Quincy, a town just south of Boston whose quarries produce a hard, fine gray stone that takes a clean edge and lasts almost forever. There were no powered saws to cut it. The quarrymen split the granite the old way, drilling a line of holes into the rock by hand, hammer on steel, turning the drill a little with each blow, hour after hour. Into those holes they drove iron wedges flanked by 2 thin curved shims, a tool the stonecutters called the plug and feather. They tapped the wedges down the line, a little at a time, building the pressure evenly along the drilled seam, until with a sound like a gunshot, the granite cracked along exactly the line they had chosen, and a block weighing many tons came free of the ledge. Then the dressers went to work with hammer and chisel, squaring the faces, truing the edges, shaping each block so it would seat against its neighbors with almost no gap at all. Stone dust hung in the air of the Quincy quarries from dawn to dusk, and the work wore men down, but the blocks that came off that hillside were cut to a precision the sea has not been able to undo in 2 centuries. Getting that granite from the Quincy Hills to the harbor was its own remarkable piece of engineering, and it is one of my favorite details in the whole story. Just a year before the dry dock began, in 1826, a man named Gridley Bryant had built something called the Granite Railway. It ran about 3 to 4 miles from the Quincy quarries down to a wharf on the Neponset River, and it is often called the first chartered commercial railway in the United States. The cars were not pulled by any engine. Horses drew them along the rails, hauling loads of cut granite that no team could have dragged over an ordinary road. Bryant had built it to carry stone for the Bunker Hill Monument, but it carried the dry dock's granite too, down to the water's edge. There the heavy blocks were loaded onto scows and small vessels and floated around through the harbor to Charlestown, where the derricks waited to lift them into place. So the stone that holds the ocean out of this dock rode a horse-drawn railway and then floated on the very sea it would one day defy. It is worth staying in Quincy for a moment, because the whole granite trade that fed this dock was young and inventive when the work began. Commercial quarrying in Quincy really started only in 1803, when a man named Newcomb Richards opened the first quarry there. The feather and wedge splitting method, the plug and feather that let a man crack a clean line through solid granite with nothing but drilled holes and hammered iron, had come into use around the year 1800, just ahead of the demand. And as the quarries went deeper, a Quincy man named Almoran Holmes invented a hoisting apparatus to lift the heavy blocks up out of the pit, a tall derrick rig that could swing tons of stone clear of the ledge. So the men cutting granite for the Navy's dry dock were working at the leading edge of a brand new American industry, an industry that was about to build some of the most famous structures in the country out of the same gray Quincy stone. Quincy granite went into Quincy Market in Boston, into the great Boston Custom House, into the Merchants Exchange on Wall Street in New York, and into the Bunker Hill Monument rising just up the hill from the Navy Yard itself in those very same years. The dry dock and the monument were quarried from the same hills, hauled on the same horse-drawn railway, and cut by the same kind of weathered hands. The chamber that would hold a warship was carved from the founding stone of American masonry. At the dock itself, the masons laid those granite blocks course by course, building the walls of the basin in long steps that descend toward the floor like a giant staircase carved into the earth. The walls had to do 2 jobs at once. They had to hold back the enormous sideways push of the harbor water and the wet ground outside, and they had to bear the weight of a fully loaded warship resting against the keel blocks at the bottom. There were no cranes as we know them. The men raised those multi-ton blocks with timber derricks, wooden masts rigged with rope tackle and turned by hand or by horse, swinging each stone out over the pit and lowering it slowly into its bed. A block set even slightly wrong could mean a leak that the sea would find and widen, so the work could not be rushed, and Baldwin and Paris held their crews to a tolerance the ocean would test every single day for the rest of the dock's life. I want to be honest about the hands that did this, because it would be easy to make it sound clean and noble, and the men who did it would not have called it either. Cutting and setting granite is some of the most dangerous heavy labor there is. A slipped block, a parted rope, a derrick that fails under load, all of it could crush or kill a man in an instant. Drilling rock by hand wears the body out and ruins the hands. Working in a flooded pit below the tide is cold, wet, brutal work, season after season. The granite cutters and the dock laborers who spent 6 years carving this chamber are mostly invisible to us now. The yard kept its accounts, and the great engineers signed their names to the design. But for the men who split the stone and dressed it and set it course by course, the ledger gives no name, only a number. They were hired, counted, paid, and replaced. And yet every clean joint in that granite, every block that has held the sea out for nearly 200 years, is the work of their hands. The fame went to the ship and to the engineers. The chamber belongs to the men the record forgot. While the stone walls climbed, another crew was solving the 2 problems that make a dry dock actually work: the gate and the pumps. The gate is the part that holds the entire harbor out, once the ship is inside. And at Charlestown, it was a wooden caisson, a great floating timber structure that could be fitted across the mouth of the dock and then flooded down to seal it tight against the stone. To bring a ship in, you flooded the dock to match the harbor, floated the caisson aside, and walked the ship in over the sill. Then you set the caisson back in the mouth, let water into it so it sank firmly into its seat, and suddenly the basin was sealed off from the sea. That wooden caisson served for most of the 1800s, and it was not replaced with a riveted steel gate until about 1902, after almost 70 years of work. The pumps were the other miracle, and here the project allowed itself one machine. Once the ship was inside and the caisson was sealed, all the water trapped in that enormous granite basin had to come out, and there is far too much of it to bail. So the dock was fitted with a steam-pumping engine, housed in its own building of Quincy granite that Alexander Paris designed. The engine was a pendulum steam engine, an unusual design patented by a Boston inventor named Ebenezer Lester, with a patent dated the 14th of May, 1827, the very year the cornerstone went down. The numbers it could move are hard to believe even now. In a test run in September of 1832, while the dock was still being finished, the pumps pulled 637,500 gallons of water out of the basin in a single hour. The whole flooded dock could be emptied in about 6 hours. That steam plant would keep the harbor at bay for more than 70 years, until electric pumps finally took over around 1905. So I want to be careful and precise here, because the title of this story says by hand, and the dock did use a steam pump, and I do not want to mislead you. The pumping was done by steam. But the chamber itself, the thing that makes a dry dock, the great carved room of stone that holds the entire ocean out and bears the weight of a warship, every block of it was quarried, dressed, and set by human hands and animal muscle, with hand drills and the plug and feather and timber derricks and ox teams. The machine emptied the basin. The men built the basin. And without the basin, the machine would have nothing to pump. When you add it all up, the cost was enormous for its day. The completed dock came to $677,089, and the ledger is exact enough to make you smile, recording $677,089.78.5. In the money of the 1830s, that was a staggering sum to spend on a single hole in the ground, and there were surely men who thought the Navy had lost its mind, pouring a fortune into a stone basin to hold ships out of the water. They were wrong, and the proof was about to float through the gate. If you are new here, and this is the kind of history you have been looking for, the quiet engineering and the named men and the unnamed hands behind the things we take for granted, take a second to subscribe, or to join the channel as a member for early access to every new film. It is the simplest way to keep work like this going. By the early summer of 1833, after 6 years, the dock was ready, and the Navy chose the perfect ship to christen it. They chose the Constitution. There was real justice in that. The ship that the country had nearly given up on, the tired old frigate whose hull had been quietly rotting for want of a place to mend her, would be the very first vessel ever cradled in the new granite chamber. The yard prepared for an event because everyone understood that something new in America was about to happen. There was, though, a small and very human race going on, and I owe you the truth about it because it matters to the story. Charlestown was not quite the first. Its twin down in Virginia, the Gosport dock near Norfolk, also designed by Baldwin, finished just slightly ahead. On the 17th of June, 1833, the Gosport dock floated in the ship of the line Delaware and docked her, 7 days before Charlestown was ready. So the honest record is this. The Gosport, or Norfolk, dry dock holds the title of the first and oldest naval dry dock in the United States by a margin of 1 week. What Charlestown can claim, and claim forever, is that it was the first dry dock ever to hold the Constitution, and that distinction has only grown more meaningful with time. On the 24th of June, 1833, they brought her in. The dock was flooded to match the harbor, the caisson was floated aside, and the Constitution was eased into the granite chamber that had been waiting 6 years for a ship. The occasion drew the powerful. The Vice President of the United States, Martin Van Buren, came to the yard to watch. President Andrew Jackson was in Boston at the time, but he was too ill to come down to the waterfront and see it. Commodore Jesse Duncan Elliott, the commandant of the yard, presided over the moment. The caisson was set into the mouth of the dock and sunk into its seat. The harbor was locked out, and the great pumps began their work. And then came the moment that makes the whole 6 years worth it. The water inside the dock began to fall. The Constitution, 3,000 tons of oak and iron and copper, hung for a while on the surface of the shrinking pool, and then her keel touched the line of wooden blocks waiting on the granite floor, and she settled onto them and stood up straight. The sea drained away around her until she sat fully in the open air, upright on dry stone, her great hull exposed from the waterline down to the keel for the first time in her life, in a chamber walled with granite, with the harbor held out just beyond the gate. Men could now walk on dry stone beneath the most famous warship in the country and put their hands on every plank of her bottom. Nothing like it had ever been seen on this side of the ocean. A nation had finally built a room where it could heal its ships. The Constitution stayed in that dock for about a year, into the summer of 1834, while the shipwrights rebuilt her from the bottom up, replacing rotten timber, recoppering her hull, making the tired old frigate sound again. The dock had done exactly what Baldwin promised it would. It had saved the ship that the country could not bear to lose. And the granite chamber had passed the only test that mattered. It had held the ocean out, dry and tight, with a warship resting inside it, exactly as designed. Word of what the Americans had built traveled. A few years later, in 1837, a Scottish engineer named David Stevenson came across the Atlantic to study American works, a man from a family that knew a great deal about building against the sea. He looked at the Charlestown and Gosport dry docks, and he called them the finest specimens of masonry he met with in America. Coming from a Scotsman whose relations built lighthouses on storm-battered rocks, that was no small praise. The young country that could not properly repair its ships 10 years earlier had, in the span of those 10 years, built stonework that one of the great engineering families of Europe judged the best in the land. Now hold the whole picture in your mind, because the scale of it is easy to lose in the details. Picture a rectangular pit at the edge of the harbor, 341 feet long in its original form, which is more than the length of a football field, walled on every side, with stepped courses of hand-cut Quincy granite descending to a stone floor. Picture the wooden caisson gate fitted across its mouth, holding back the entire weight of Boston Harbor. Picture the granite engine house beside it, the steam pumping plant inside, ready to empty the whole basin in 6 hours. And picture, on the floor of that chamber, a wooden warship standing upright on her blocks in the dry air, sunlight on a hull that should be deep underwater, men crawling over her bottom with caulking irons and copper sheets. Every part of that scene, except the pumping engine, was made by hand. From stone, the men split off a hillside with wedges and dressed with chisels, and floated to the harbor on horse-drawn rails and small boats. It is a Roman idea, executed with Yankee stubbornness, in granite that has not moved. What makes this story land for me is not only what the dock did in 1833, it is what it has kept doing ever since. Most of the great hand-built works of that era are gone now, or buried, or replaced by something larger. This one is not. Dry Dock 1 at the Charlestown Navy Yard is still there, and it is still in service, the oldest operating dry dock in the United States. It worked through the age of sail and into the age of iron and steel. It serviced ships through the Civil War, when the Charlestown Yard built and repaired vessels for the Union. It held destroyers and submarines through both World Wars and on into the Cold War. The dock was extended over the years, lengthened first in the 1850s and again in the 1940s to take longer ships, but its heart is still that original granite chamber the men carved between 1827 and 1833. And here's the detail that I keep coming back to, the one that gives me a small chill every time. The ship that first floated into Dry Dock 1 in 1833, the Constitution, the same old Ironsides, is still afloat today, as the oldest commissioned warship in the world still afloat. And when she needs work, she still goes back into that same granite dock. The dock and the ship have been keeping each other alive for nearly 2 centuries. The chamber the men carved by hand to save her in 1833 is the chamber that saves her still. Think about what that continuity actually means. The Quincy granite those quarrymen split with hand drills, and the plug and feather is holding the same ocean out today that it held out in 1833. The walls Alexander Paris watched the masons lay, course by careful course, are still bearing the load. When the Constitution settles onto her blocks now, in our own time, she is resting in a room shaped by men whose names the ledger never kept, men who worked for a daily wage in the cold tidal mud almost 200 years ago and then vanished from the record entirely. They could not have imagined the country that would still be floating its oldest ship into their stone basin. But that is exactly what their work made possible. The granite outlived the granite cutters by lifetimes, and it is still doing the one job they built it to do. The dock changed more than one ship, too. It proved to the United States Navy and to the nation that America could build the heavy infrastructure of a serious naval power, the deep, permanent, stone and steam works that let a country maintain a fleet for the long haul. After Charlestown and Gosport, more dry docks followed, in New York and Philadelphia and elsewhere, each one a little larger as the ships grew, but all of them descended from the lesson of those first 2 granite chambers of 1833. The careening of warships on their sides faded into history. The marine railways gave way to stone docks that could lift a whole battle fleet clear of the water. The idea Baldwin executed at Charlestown became the standard, and the American capacity to keep a navy in fighting trim was built, in part, on the proof that a hull carved in granite by hand could hold the sea out reliably, year after year, ship after ship. So, I think about Loami Baldwin sometimes, the boy who learned his trade at 14 digging the Middlesex Canal beside his father, dying in Charlestown in 1838, only 5 years after his granite dock held its first ship. He did not live to see most of what it would do. He never saw the Civil War ships, or the submarines, or the Constitution coming home to his dock again and again across the centuries. He built a careful, expensive, beautiful thing out of stone that the whole world said could not be done in a country that young, and then he died, and the stone went on working without him. That is the bargain the great builders of that age made, mostly without saying so. They poured their lives into things that would outlast them by centuries, and they trusted that the work would hold. Baldwin's held. It is holding right now. Which leaves me with a harder question, and I am going to hand it to you, because I genuinely do not know the answer. We tend to assume that the truly permanent things, the works that last 200 years and counting, had to wait for steel and concrete and powerful machines. But the men who carved Dry Dock 1 had none of that for the part that matters. They split the granite with wedges, dressed it with chisels, floated it on horse-drawn rails and small boats, and set it with timber derricks and rope, and the chamber they made has outlasted nearly everything built around it, and still holds the ocean out today. So here is what I keep wondering. If we tried to build something today that we expected to still be doing its exact job in the year 2220, with the sea pressing against it every hour of every day, do you honestly believe we would build it as well as those unnamed granite cutters did in Boston Harbor by hand? I have my own suspicion about the answer. I would like to hear yours down in the comments, because I do not think it is nearly as obvious as we would like to pretend. If you want the deeper origin of all of this, the canal digging, water moving, stone setting age that made works like the Charlestown Dry Dock possible, the full illustrated story of the Erie Canal is waiting behind the code on your screen. Scan it, pick it up, and thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I will see you at the next one.